Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us today. Today is all about a creative strategy which we think will be interested in, modelled from Walt Disney, and we'll see the people in the seminar today, the webinar, are experts in this field. So let's just so we understand what we're talking about here. Let us just say, what do we mean by a creative strategy, so we're not thinking of the wrong things. So the way I looked it up and found some sort of consensus definitions was: a strategy is a workable pathway to a desired outcome, not surprisingly, or to even overcome a problem. And if it's creative, then it's using a slightly unusual or different approach. So those are the two kind of watchwords really for today. For this particular webinar. Now, I should say other creative strategies are available. As you will probably know, there are a number that people use. You've probably heard of Edward de Bono's Six Thinking Hats, for example, is another way of doing stuff like this. And we don't intend to go into any of those today. Perhaps in a future webinar, we might. But anyway, for now, I'd just like to run you through what we'll be doing today. We'll meet the panel in a moment, and then after that, we'll be talking to Robert Dilts, who really introduced the Imagineering concept as a modeled way of doing this sort of development. And then we'll look into more detail about how we use the Imagineering process. It's called Imagineering. Then we'll apply the roles of the dreamer, realist, and critic, those names you've just given us your feedback on, to some typical project issues. And we'd like to, if we've got time, we'll get some input from you on that. And then we'll look at some of the more practical things of using Imagineering in your environment, and things you might need to avoid, perhaps. And then right at the end, we'll show you how to get hold of more information about Imagineering if you need to take things a bit further. So just before we start, let's meet our panel. We have Robert Dilts, who isn't here today. He's actually teaching in China today, but I managed to catch up with him at his home in California a few days ago, and we have a recorded interview with him. We also have Emma McNally, who's got a background in project and program change management. She's worked in a senior role at Essex County Council and teaches and is a consultant and a coach. We have Veale, who is a psychologist and psychiatrist, a qualified coach and NLP master trainer, and has developed her own business, Reveale Solutions Training. So we have people in the webinar today who use this stuff every day with clients. So hopefully we'll get some real world wisdoms from them. So the first thing we're going to do is find out what Robert Dilts himself says about this. So, Robert, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar today. It's great to have you. We're discussing the Disney Imagineering strategy. So let's ask a few pertinent questions about this. You're the man to tell us. So you first wrote about Disney's creative strategy over 30 years ago in your book, Strategies of Genius, Volume 1. And since then, it's been studied and developed and taught as a highly effective way of addressing and overcoming problems. Could you give us a quick synopsis of how it works?
Yes, it's actually, I mean, in some ways, it's deceptively simple. There's three fundamental phases. We say there's the dreamer phase, where you are imagining what's possible. Then there's the realist phase, where you're taking what you've imagined and you're beginning to sort of put it into some sort of practical application. And then there's the critic phase, where you are looking at what has been, created from the dream through the realist, and evaluating, is that good enough? Is there something missing? Is there more that's needed? And then there is often what we would say a sort of a fourth position there, which is what we would call a meta position, or kind of an orchestrator position. You could say sort of a leadership position, where you're kind of managing that dynamic between dreamer, realist, and critic.
Okay, so we know that Walt Disney used this technique, which we've come to call Imagineering, to create the future, so to speak, by turning a dream into reality in a structured kind of a way. And Disney I guess, typically use this in the process of creating a movie, so which is in every sense a project. Our audience today is made up of project managers from various different businesses and organizations. So would you say that this technique is applicable to pretty much any project that's got a similar characteristic where you're creating a change, where you've got to start and finish milestones, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. I mean, Disney himself also used it, I think, when he was creating his amusement parks, when he would create his, animatronic, characters and things. He used it for many different aspects. But certainly, I agree, any project, I've written over 30 books. I use that strategy, every time. It is probably the most archetypal, fundamental creative process, creative strategy. I think those three phases, dreamer, realist, critic, are exactly what's needed for any project. And it has been used I brought it certainly to many, many, many companies around the world, and it has been used for all kinds of projects very successfully.
Okay. These days, we have a world in which team players are celebrated, really, and sometimes being critical, which isn't the same as being the critic, I know, but appearing to be critical is often seen as negative. And I'm just wondering what your experience is of how we can best reconcile the critic's input as a valued input to the team.
I think, as you point out, Tim, like the critic is sort of one of the more challenging parts of this. Everybody loves the dreamer, the realist is great. They tend to think of the critic as a killer. In fact, the thing that I read about Disney that actually initially sparked me really creating this was a comment that one person that worked with Disney for many years said. He said, well, there's actually three different Walt Disneys. There's the dreamer, the realist, and then he said the spoiler. Not even the critic. But we tend to think of the critic as the spoiler because they're critical. And now here's what I do. One of the things I say is you really need the critic. Without the critic, you're not going to be able to have fully formed, finely tuned result. So one of the things that I like to do, problem with the critic is that usually the critic makes a sort of a blunt statement. That's too expensive. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough people, or we're going to run out of these resources. And then basically all you can do with a statement is sort of counter it. Well, yes, we do. No, we don't. Yes, we do. But one of the things to realize is that every critic, and certainly every criticism, has a positive intention. So we say, first is I've got to focus on the positive intention of that critic or criticism, and then turn it into a question. I like to say behind every criticism is a really good how question. So if somebody says, that's too expensive, you go, oh, so your question is, how will we afford it? Somebody says, oh, there's not enough time. Oh, so your question is, how will we get this done in a timely way? So I think, first of all, realizing that the critic has an absolutely essential role, number one. Number two, that behind every criticism is a positive intention. And then number three, if you can transform that criticism into a question, then you've got the gold, you have the gem. I like to say it's a kind of a verbal Aikido. Elon Musk says, there's nothing more valuable than a well thought out critique. Now, the whole thing is it's got to be well thought out. And a lot of times criticisms are just reactive. So that's this kind of idea too. Is we say maybe one last comment about that is that when the criticism comes from what we call a kind of a crash state, which is like a reactive state, it's usually not going to be very helpful. So you kind of need to get kind of everybody into a more calm frame of mind and then explore again, what is this intention? What is this question?
I'm sure that in the places you have taught this technique, you've got some examples of where the three roles have been used in places and organizations, maybe technical environments where you wouldn't expect, or they wouldn't expect to use this kind of approach. So could you tell us a bit about some tried and tested ways of introducing Imagineering in these sorts of situations? In other words, where people might need to give themselves permission to do it this way, if you like.
Right. One of the reasons I think this is such a powerful process is that I've never found it very difficult to introduce this to people. I think everybody understands the idea of a dreamer and the notion of brainstorming, of using imagination, of being able to picture some possibility. Certainly people understand the notion of realist, the interesting thing I would say, Tim, is that in most businesses that I go to, managers especially go, I am not paid to be a dreamer, I'm paid to be a realist. some people are actually paid to be critics. Usually they're the financial people, the accountants, the lawyers, the attorneys. But I think once we frame that these, first of all, that everybody, interestingly, pretty much everybody knows Disney. Everybody respects that, he did something that was really, useful. I can have different words for dreamer. We can talk about imagining or brainstorming. You can have different words for realist, although usually you don't need it. In fact, Imagineering itself is a combined word, imagination, engineering. And it's usually, of course, the critic that is the tricky one. And this is where we would say, well, you need to have some form of evaluation, some kind of advisor. So, we say, well, okay, we're going to do some, you're going to do some imagining, then you're going to do some planning, then you're going to do some evaluating. That's not difficult to explain to people personally. So that's usually the way I would, present it.
And in your writings, for example, in your book, Modeling with NLP, you make a point that people need to try and enter the physiological and mental characteristics
Absolutely.
of the realist. How important is that?
I think, from the NLP perspective, we would say that's essential. That's what actually is going to make it work. So, if you think about dreaming, well, what do we mean dreamer? Right. So we know it's about imagination, but how does one do that? How do you encourage, let's say, a whole team of people to enter this modality? And so this is where we say there is a cognitive aspect. So dreaming is literally visualizing. Oftentimes when I'm working with an organization or with people I'm introducing it, I will actually show images of Disney working with his teams. And you'll see in the dreamer phase, people are all kind of back, they're kind of laid back, they're open, you're sort of like you're sort of dreamy-eyed, you're looking out. And then there's a set of questions, because that's the other thing. What drives the effectiveness of each of these modalities is what questions are you seeking to answer? And then the physical part is very important because, again, imagine if somebody's sitting like this and I say, well, what's your dream? Imagine the future. It's probably going to be pretty difficult. You're not going to get a very good answer. Likewise, if somebody's like this and you say, all right, let's be realist. How specifically are we going to do this? Once again, you're not going to get the best answer. So we say usually the dreamer, you want to be open. Eyes are typically going to be sort of up, looking off to the future. The realist, you want to be more leaning forward. You're more focused. It's more what we say action-oriented rather than vision-oriented. And then when you get to the critic, you've got sort of this interesting, more analytical posture where, and it's also a little bit more, we say more asymmetrical because you're kind of trying to find, well, what doesn't fit here? And usually what we want to do is you want to be asking questions about the core values that this project is trying to, get across.
There's going to be a point where we need to deploy the findings. And it's quite possible we might find that the outcome we were seeking is through this creative process is just not doable, or it's just not a good idea.
Right.
So hopefully we can take some learnings from the process to either recalculate or take something positive out of the full stop we've just reached in a way.
Right. It's interesting about that. For a number of years, I ran what's called a mastermind group in the Silicon Valley. Mastermind group is a sort of you could call it a kind of an advanced brainstorming group of high-level people who are there to sort of support each other. So I had people from, the co-founder of Siri, a person who was the founder of Google X, which is the ones that made the self-driving car and the Google glasses. So very high-level people. And one of the questions I remember asking was, okay, when do you pull the plug? When do you decide to say no? And it was kind of fascinating. They kind of almost like said, well, we don't ever really say no. What they say is you pivot. So pivoting means, all right, I've got to take everything that we've learned. We're not going to actually throw it away. You don't fail. But you're going to then say, all right, now how can we take what we've learned and actually use that for something else?
Apart from your many books that talk about Imagineering and, of course, our panel members on this webinar who can help with this stuff, where can people go to find out more about the technique?
Well, certainly there are many NLP institutes around that teach this. And there's, for example, the ANLP in the UK. You can find out many people who are teaching this. Of course, I have my own website, it's robertdilts.com, but we'll have information about that. But I think it's a very well-known process that's used by a lot of NLP consultants, and I know you will have some that will be sharing about how they use it. But I think kind of going to a good NLP organization like ANLP would be a great place for people to find out more.
Okay, so that's a very interesting sort of quick run through what Imagineering is all about. At this point, what we're going to do is Emma and Reb and I are going to take you into a little more detail about how we take on those three personalities really in the development of an Imagineering session or intervention. So let's take them in turn. Emma, I think you're going to start us off by telling us about what the dreamer does.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. So if I was working in that dreamer space, the first thing I would do, as Robert so clearly told us, is to get into that physiology, that open, looking up and looking to really tap into our own creativity and imagination. So in terms of physiology as well, quite relaxed and quite open. And if I was working with a group, I tend to use a wall and have that as our dreamer wall. And I would be looking to think about what could be possible? What could we do? There's no boundaries. If there was no restrictions, what could we do? I would look very much in terms of like the big picture, very much future focus, and that whole almost the natural child. If any of you have ever done any transactional analysis work, that real playful, creative, fun, open, curious kind of way of being. I would very much look at stating options with positive language. So rather than saying what we don't want, say what we do want. So we want it to do this or to do that, or really keeping that open mind. Very much, again, keeping in mind that vision and that purpose. So very much, where are we going? What do we need it to look like? And what if there was no constraints? What if there was no budget constraints? And the question that I love to ask is, what would ... do? So what would Einstein do? What would Walt Disney do? What would Robert Dilts do? What would your competitor do? So just to expand from where we're at, to have that bigger picture and really that big chunk, that new choices and the what part of the plan. And the things I would avoid around this one as well, because we have to be conscious that we need to keep in that space of dreamer, is avoid moving on to realist and critic too early, okay? So ask that, and what else? So when you come to an edge and you think there's nothing else, so okay, there's nothing else, but if there was something else, what would that be? So really starting to expand, because it tends to be beyond our existing boundaries is where the answer could be. So very much that expansive, going beyond, and rather than overanalyzing, that all comes later, to stick into that very beautiful creative space, include everybody, and yeah, the criticism or the analysis or the evaluation comes later. So stay in that dreamer space. So yes.
Great. Thank you, Emma. That's perfect. So I'm going to take the role of the realist. I assure you we used a democratic process to get to this. Anyway, so as the realist, I'm going to take all of the suggestions in turn that the dreamer has created, and take them really on face value. So I'm looking at not the whether it's even possible. I'm looking at the how could I do it? If it is possible, how could I do this? So I'm looking at, okay, would I be able to plan this in a realistic way? What would I need to do it? Would I need different resources? How much resource? Would I need to organize ideas in a certain way in order to get the information flow going correctly? I'm always moving towards a solution to the dream. So I'm trying to get to the point where I am being completely practical about even if that's not, if we think it's marginally possible, how could we do it? So I'm not making any assumptions about the realism or not of the idea that the dreamers come up with. I'm saying, if we could do it, how would we do it? The question is always how. I'm thinking in terms of the short term. I'm thinking about right now, what would I need to do to plan this? And I'm always acting as if it's possible to do it. So I'm, again, as Robert says, I'm coming from a very positive perspective. I'm saying, I'm not even going to question. I'm going to say, if it's possible to do that, how can I do it? And that's pretty much what the realist would do with that information.
Thanks so much, Tim. Moving on to the critic. One of the things that amused me when you and Robert were talking in the video there was that people get a bit shifty around critic because they may have baggage around being labelled negative, may get defensive. And one of the things I often think in this process is, actually, when we get to critic, we get to have some fun, because what we're doing, it's important, is we're critiquing any plans that have been put together. We're not critiquing the vision or the dream itself. We're not critiquing the people involved in dreamer or realist. We're really being the truth seekers. So we're the people who can, in the words of someone in Star Trek, make it so. I think it was Jean-Luc Picard. So this is about, so why would we do this? Why wouldn't we? And we can have a bit of fun around this. So our job here is, if you like, to embody perhaps a few archetypes you might think of. Maybe think of Agatha Christie. It's like the great whodunit. We've got to find those clues to really work it out. Or maybe Hermione Granger with her famous analytical skills. Maybe with a little bit of Dr. Spock, or Mr. Spock, sorry, thrown in for good measure. So this is where we identify, well, what could possibly go wrong? It's actually our job to find those cracks. If you think of many projects throughout the years, and none in the organisations represented on this particular webinar, but it may be that nobody said, oh, no, hang on a minute, we need to stop. I'm reminded of the Grolsch advert where they said, stop, this beer is not ready. Actually, they were protecting quality. That's what the primary role of critic is about. So when I'm being the critic, I'm asking, what could possibly go wrong? What challenges could I foresee? Now, that might be drawing on my previous experience from previous projects or programs. It might be from a previous organization where something like this has been tried. So we're actually able to draw on all of that experience, and I'll identify, so once before when we tried this, this was something that got flagged up or something that went wrong that we can then avoid. We can learn from those lessons learned. So I'm therefore looking at both the past, what happened in the past, and also horizon scanning and looking to the future. What might happen if we put this spanner in the works, if that happened? This is an extremely evaluative phase. This is where we're finally able to take all of the output richly coming from Dreamer and Realist and really evaluate, okay, in the real world, what would happen if we did do that? So we're really testing those things out. We're looking to keep the positive byproducts. I think Robert talked about making sure that we come from a positive intention, that that's recognized. A couple of the things when I'm acting as the critic that I always think about is I'm looking for any flaws, any potential fly in the ointment. I'm treating it like a puzzle or a conundrum, looking out for those small clues that might be the difference, that makes the difference. From an engineering perspective, and you may have some engineering project managers on the call, I'm looking for any points of failure. I'm really trying to anticipate how could I break this without actually trying to, because that's what's going to save this. This is where honesty, I think, came up in the word cloud. Another one that I was really pleased to see was disruptor. This is where we really make sure that something is fit to sale, something is fit for purpose, and actually is going to stand the rigors of being put into practice. So I think Robert mentioned Elon Musk's quote that he constantly seeks criticism because a well thought out critique of what you're doing is as valuable as gold. So there's probably a reason why he's pretty successful. It may not be the charms of his personality, but maybe his process is sufficiently critical.
Great, thank you, Bev. That's given you an idea of the three personalities, and of course, the critical thing about the Dreamer Realist Critic is that you can iterate it. In fact, you really should try and iterate it, I would say, to try and go round again, because it's quite possible that when you reach that phase that Reb's just described, where you've sort of said, well, you know, what could go wrong? Well, you might find that something could desperately go wrong, and in which case you need to say, well, let's go back and see what else we could, what other things could we do, and then go round again. Now, obviously, you need to be sensible about this. You can't keep doing this forever. There comes a point where you have to stop and actually create an action plan out of this. This was the fourth position that Robert mentioned, the sort of meta position, I think he called it, which is where the leader of this process would be often the project manager, I suspect, would say, right, what have we got here? We've looked at this from three different perspectives. What have we got that's actually going to help us? It's at the end of the day, that's the whole point. And one of the other things that he mentioned when he talked about people pivoting, when they've got an idea that it's not going to work, or they have to try and think of it a different way, is, I would say, always honor the byproducts that you get, because you will find that stuff you never thought of comes out, and when it does, please make a note of it. Documenting this is really critical. I would say. I don't know, Emma, do you find a similar thing when you're teaching it?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it's that point that something that sparks an idea, that idea, even if you can't use it right here, right now, you might be able to use it later. In my experience, when I've worked in projects and we've done this sort of thing, there might be an idea that you've gone through and got to the critic stage, and it's great, we need to pivot, but actually later on down the line, that then becomes that nugget, that gold of like, hang on a second, there's something there that we can explore, and something that we could actually, unlock some great potential. So yeah, for sure, absolutely.
Reb, do you have a take on that too at all?
Yeah, definitely. I would say the flip side of what Emma said, which is sometimes the pivot might be, okay, we've expended a certain amount of budget and time and effort, and we've identified that if we continue going down this route, that would actually be a net loss, or it would be inappropriate use of our time or resources. So sometimes that pivot might be, okay, now we're going to go and take a different tack, or we're going to shift the project scope, for example.
Okay, so now we're going to take an example that came up in one of the APM's forums. This was a real problem that somebody had posted in the APM community forum to try and get some ideas from people. We're going to use that as an example of how we might, and we'll do this, the three of us will do it together, how we might apply Dreamer Realist Critic to that. So the problem was this. The question was asked, how do you continue to deliver your project when out of nowhere a new additional requirement is introduced? I can probably, if I could see you, I see a lot of people going, yeah, I know all about that. An additional requirement is suddenly introduced. You've already allocated all your project budget and presumably resources, but everything, including this new one, is a must-have requirement. So how might we apply Imagineering to help solve that particular issue? Just invite the two members of the panel here as to how we might apply our thinking here to that situation. Let me start with you, Reb. So we'll go around and we'll chip in, but what would you do to start with? You've got this new thing, got to deliver it, right, used up all your money or you've allocated your money. What do? How do you kind of dream a way out of that?
So the first thing is taking Robert's advice, which is staying calm. Certainly, I've been managing a program a long time ago now in the past when this very thing happened. And we're all familiar with the project management triangle or the iron triangle. And the first thing is to get tense and probably swear at whoever it is that's thrown in the extra ball. So staying calm is the first thing. And then recognizing that actually, whatever the vision or dream was to start with, it's undeniably changed because we have different parameters, we have different scope now. So re-envisioning what is the dream now, because that's a really useful blank place to start.
Okay, and I guess we could, there might be other things we could think. I'm being a dreamer here because I'm looking up. How could we reduce scope somewhere else, perhaps, if that's even possible, without affecting the requirements, because they're not always the same thing. And another thought might be, could we deliver the project in phases so that we've got different timings? So this new requirement is perhaps delivered later. That might be another thing to do. Emma, do you have any wisdoms there?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, just on that, I would just make sure that I would get the right people in the room as well to start with, because this is something that the reason why I love this model is because it very much, if you get the right people in the room, it's about engagement. So I would want to be including people like an end user, for example, in the room, depending on what the project is, obviously. But actually, if you include all of those, yes, the scope has changed. Yes, what else could we do? And I said that if you do this at the beginning of a project, there may be some things that at that time you parked that maybe now are relevant. So that whole, hey, we've got a blank piece of paper, let's reimagine what could we do now that's going to be useful and take us forward. But getting the buy-in to the key stakeholders, I think, is a critical element there as well. Yeah.
Okay, I should mention, I forgot to mention that if you like to use your question box to put something simple up that we might be able to look at. Obviously, we can only do so much in our limited time here today, but if you've got a particular issue that you might think, well, how do you apply these three personalities to that? Do put it into the question box, and if we've got time, we'll deal with that. So that's really looking at how we apply the dreamer to this, the realist. What would we be looking at here? Can we get more budget? What else do you think?
So various questions that might come up are, so a budget is one thing and real revenue and real expenditure are others. Getting really pragmatic, it might be, okay, have we made any savings against our projected expenditure? Because that now then adds into our real budget. So getting very real and very current and present moment, I think you said earlier on, and also redefining potential quality of deliverables. We've all had the discussion as project or program managers before. Okay, if costs can't change and time scale can't change, then there's one thing that may well have to change, and that might be the quality of the deliverable.
It might even be that you can look, especially if you're working in like a program kind of field or a portfolio, are there other projects that could support and you could work in collaboration with? Is there something else that you could do together that could enable you to have and deliver what you need to deliver? So just thinking again a bit more, what else is there that you could tap into?
Actually, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it forces you to think about your project, your deliverable, in the ecology of all the other things that are surrounding you. And can we work with this? If I get another department to handle this bit for me, can we do it that way? Sort of thing. So you've got to kind of think outside of the box. So the realist has to, be thinking practically, not in a dreamer sense, but thinking practically. Can I phone so and so and ask them if they could deal this for us? Interestingly, let's move on to the critic, because the critic in this situation, right? So we've thought about some ideas we could look at. Again, it's stretching the model a little bit, but how do we apply the role of the critic to this situation where we've thought about some ideas we could try, and we've got possibly a way of planning it? We might think about swapping people with another project, and then the critic comes in and says, all right, who are the, for example, who are the stakeholders are going to be affected? What will they do? What else might the critic throw at this to try and, in a positive way, to try and see if they've tested it properly?
So one of the things I most appreciated was that a couple of people put honest in the word cloud. And I often get quite protective of the critic in this process because it's so equated with negativity, like I said earlier on. But actually the critic is the person or the role. When we're in this role, the whole team can be really honest. And I sometimes think of the emperor's new clothes. If only they'd had people working as the critic to say, you do realize you're not wearing any clothes. This is where we really get to identify any potential points of failure and really flag it up either to the sponsor or the organization or the end users so that they can consider, oh yes, we really do need to allocate more budget or whatever it might be. But that's our job at this stage. It's really to flag up those potential points of weakness.
Okay, a question's come in from Helen Taylor. Is the role of the critic similar to the concept of, in quotes, radical candor, if that makes sense?
Oh, I love that concept.
Radical candor is great. Emma, do you have
It
a view?
really is. As long as we are critiquing the output of the realist as opposed to any of the individuals. This is another reason why, as Emma said, doing this as a program or project team or as a broader team, a group of people, can really be effective because no one gets labeled as an individual and we can all participate in the resolution process. Love that radical candor. Thank you.
Another one's come in. The project proposal, this is her in her world, project proposal has been rejected for being too large. Right. Product management won't compromise on what the product needs to achieve, and R&D can't come up with an approach with a reduced time scale. What do we do? Where do we start? That's a big one, possibly too big for us to deal with today. But that's the kind of thing where I think we would probably want to apply Imagineering, wouldn't we, to a fairly radical issue there. Nobody wants to play anymore. What do we do? Let me see if there's another couple here that we've got. Okay, optioneering based on. So I'm trying to just look at some of the questions here. Okay, so Toby Lawrence says, how would you relate a systems thinker, systems engineer, and a systems integrator into this model? So systems thinker, systems engineer, and systems integrator. Slightly different thing there. Any thoughts on that? The systems thinker, it's not a role I've come across, to be honest. But I'm sure it is a thing in systems development. Okay.
So it's certainly not my area of expertise, but what I would say from a systemic perspective, he predates most of us. Heraclitus, fairly clever Greek chap, said wisdom comes from multiple perspectives. And that's exactly what's behind both a systemic approach and this model or this process, this way of attacking a situation from a number of different perspectives.
Okay.
Absolutely. And just on that, again, not my detailed area of expertise, but each of those, the thinker, the integrator, etc., it would be really useful for them to step into each of those roles, the dreamer, the realist, and the critic, all together. So rather than sticking with your own preference, to be able to expand your own repertoire, to be able to step into, as Reb says, into somebody else's shoes in that way, that new perspective actually gives you an appreciation. Okay, an appreciation. We talked quite a lot about the critic, and sometimes it gets a bad rap. But if you stepped into those shoes, you will know how valuable each one of those positions is, and how critical they all are to success. So even if we have labels of like, as Robert said, the attorney or the finance, which would naturally fall into that, but actually stretching our own map of the world, as we say in NLP, can absolutely be beneficial, because that's where the learnings and answers can come and opportunities can come. Yeah.
There's another question here from Mohsin Jamil, who says, okay, stakeholder engagement. Optioneering based on the additional requirements will be useful to evaluate the scope change. So what Mohsin is doing is saying, okay, never mind the whole project. Let's just look at that new requirement that's been sort of landed on us, and do the process on that. I think that's what Mohsin means there. Is that something you can sort of step out of the major big loop and start working on a particular issue, or is that taking it to a ridiculous extreme?
I completely say yes on that. I've used it for risk. For example, a risk might pop up in a project. Actually, you can step into all of those three areas to find a solution to that risk. So yes, absolutely. Yes, you can do it for the whole project, absolutely. But you can do it for gateways, for problems, for you name it. You can do it for it. So that's why it's so fabulous, because you can apply it to the big picture as well as the smaller elements. So yeah, definitely.
What do you think, Reb?
I completely agree. One of the things that Robert said early on in the video is this is a deceptively simple model. Now, one of the great things about that is it makes it incredibly flexible. So whether you look at a discrete risk, a discrete new parameter, whether you look at the whole of the concept of the program, even when the sponsor is first mooting it, you can use it when you're doing lessons learned. You can use it at every single stage, iteratively, a number of times, whether micro or macro, and it will always work and pay dividends.
Let's just talk about some of the things around the process, because it is very much a process, as you both made a point about it. Imagineering is a process, and in project management world, we like processes. We sort of live on them, and so in that sense, we've got to think of it as a whole model. And I wanted to just check on your take on this, because you guys use it every day pretty much in your work. Where you have you're applying I don't know what we call it, an Imagineering intervention or process to a client's issue. Is it, in your view, better to just keep it to the individual, to the team that's dealing with the issue, or are there times when bringing in an external viewpoint would be helpful, maybe a consultant, or what we in Exxon we used to call a cold eyes review? But that sort of thing, is that a bad idea or a good idea when you want to keep your team kind of nose to the grindstone? What do you think?
Having somebody external can be beneficial, because then the actual group can focus on and be like a facilitator, the meta position, as Robert was saying, to take them through. Absolutely, it can be beneficial. I would say when you're looking at setting it up, who should be in the room, and it may be wider than just the team, because sometimes I can't remember who exactly said the thinking. I think it was Einstein. The way that a problem is created, you need different thinking to enable a solution. So if you've got the same group that's always involved, you may want to expand that out. And in my experience, different stakeholders, end users and maybe a facilitator, I think is really key to make sure that it runs smoothly and that we have clean positions. Yeah, so when we're in this one and then we're moving to that one and then we're moving to this one, that we're very clean transitions between, because that's where the success is. So yes, having a facilitator makes it easier. It's not to say a project manager can't do it, and absolutely, and that's why we're sharing this model with you guys, because absolutely learn it and use it, but it can make it easier. Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, I completely agree with everything that Em said, and she's used it to a great extent at really senior levels extensively, both public and private sectors. And broadening out the point around the fresh pair of eyes or cold pair of eyes, getting additional input from a person or different stakeholder groups can be really valuable. And it's not just the people. So if you're going to do it within a program or project team, getting them to use a different environment, so taking them out of, if they have a project office, getting them outside that environment to a different space physiologically. Em already alluded to, and Robert talked about, actually a different physiology, maybe standing, maybe even lying down on beanbags. There's a regional governmental organisation that shall remain nameless that I did a lot of work with, and they had a free thinking room where they had lots of beanbags. They had the ceiling painted blue with clouds on, and it wasn't just a gimmick. They actually did their brainstorming in that room. Having things like flip chart paper or lining paper from B&Q, even cheaper, round the walls so that people can really be very visual in their thinking. All of those different aspects of difference can really freshen up our thinking in using this particular process and can add unexpected results and benefits in.
Okay. So let's just see if we can start to pull this together as we're closing in on the hour now. If we can go through roughly in synopsis, Emma, you could start us off with this. How we, where we start this process, because this will be something people have not done before. So what's the sort of headline advice in terms of how to get stuck into Dream a Realist Critic?
Yeah, absolutely. So the order is really, really important. We need to start in Dreamer, okay? Because if you don't start in that, it doesn't work, basically. If you haven't had that Dreamer phase, you haven't got the ideas that you're then going to apply the realist and the critic to. So Dreamer is the absolute beginning, the start. And then we do, that clean shift into realist. And again, spending that time in realist is really, really important. And then through to critic. So that's the order that it needs to be. Dreamer on its own, you're just going to have dreams. You're never going to have any plans or think the risks in terms of putting it in place. If you just had the realist, then there's no ideas to put in a plan. And I think Robert talks about if you have a dreamer and critic together without the realist, it's a roller coaster, because there's an idea and then there's oh no, what about? Oh, there's an idea, no, what about? So again, can you see how you have to have all of those three in that order? But as we said already, it can be iterative. So you come through to critic and then step back into dreamer if you need to and go round again. So yeah, very much that iterative cycle, but the order is critical. Dreamer, realist, critic. Yeah.
Okay. And then Reb, pulling it all together, what's the sort of practical ideas here?
It's, as Em was saying, it is iterative. So taking the key things forward and really checking where you are on all of them, keeping all the people all the time, making sure that no individual is being labelled, that you're really deciding together, what do we take forward, and allowing yourself the permission to, what do we jettison for now, or at least pivot and park on the side.
So I suppose I would add to that, being a process junkie. I go to I'm trying to take tablets for it, but anyway, yeah, process for me is critical here. So being able to capture this stuff is really, really important. The tools you might use to capture the information, the ideas. Have a think about that, because I would say that when you come to look at it 3 months later, if you think, what the hell did we mean by that? It doesn't help you. So having an action plan and the various bits like the byproducts that you can use, have a good way of recording it, I would say. Some people use things like mind maps and so on to keep this sort of stuff going. So, okay, so just really when implementing, let's just think about some of the things we might want to pay specific attention to.
Absolutely. So we've already said it. It is a balanced strategy. Okay. So each of the elements are equally important, but in the right order. Okay. So as I've just said, dreamer, realist, critic, and then encouraging all team members to adopt all positions. So again, just reiterating, it's not like, oh, well, that's my preference, so I just stick in that one. Get everybody to step in, because sometimes it's the person that's maybe not so familiar with that particular position that might have this amazing idea or might come up with that nugget that's so important. So absolutely do that. And as Reb said earlier, we're critiquing the ideas, not the other roles. Okay, so it's not a personal thing. So if somebody has an idea, that's out there, we're not saying, oh no, and we're not criticizing, we're just very much going, okay, great. It's just in all of the roles, we're not criticizing the roles or the people, it's just ideas. And then the process benefits from doing it iteratively. But then when to stop? So important, this bit, because yes, you can go round, but there needs to be a time where you draw a line and go, right, okay, now we have our plan, now we're going to do it. So now we're going to implement. So yeah, without that delivery, then it's just ideas, isn't it? So yeah, very much when to draw a line and when to actually implement what you've come up with. So yeah.
Reb, some of the other bits of it, do you think?
So the second stage is about, in the broadest possible sense, resource planning, whether that be time, space, people, other resources. When you're planning your session of using this, it could be just an hour's meeting. As Em has said, make sure that you're going to allocate enough time to each of these, not just the favourite bits. If you do have more time, I would say even a whole day spent using this process iteratively will be well worth it. Record the points. I said before about using different spaces, different materials, flip charts, lining paper. Are the right people in the room, Em said, and leave enough time to bring all the points together. So it's not just about dividing your time by 3. Leave time in between to choose what are you taking forward and where are we now at the end of that.
And of course, decide how you're going to take your answer and present it. Who's going to do that? If it needs signing off, who does that? There might be some byproducts. Make sure you honour those and deal with them. And the action plan might suggest doing some Imagineering in another part of the organisation. You never know. So that's really a top level sort of canter through Imagineering. The slide on your screen, and this is where you can get hold of us if you need to find out a bit more about doing an Imagineering intervention. All of our details are on there. I'm sure that the links all work. So when you get that link to this slide, you'll be able to find us. And I think that's pretty much it. So thank you very much to Emma McNally, to Red Veale, to Robert Dilts, and to you for joining us.